Having been born and raised in a polygamist home myself, I'm painfully aware of the use that they have when they use God in the teachings and threatenings of living polygamy. We were constantly threatened that we comply or be damned, accept polygamy or be destroyed, which is what Joseph Smith said in section 132. We were conditioned from the cradle when we grew up believing that it was God's requirement to become a plural wife. We were brainwashed. We were frightened into accepting it. So I can understand being born and raised with a polygamous mindset when that's all you've known since birth. It's natural to believe it. But none of the plural wives of Joseph Smith's and these early Mormons were born and raised in a polygamy culture. They had not been brainwashed from birth like we were. Polygamy was not something they were familiar with. It had nothing to do with salvation as far as they knew up until that point. Yet they believed what Joseph Smith claimed, that it was a holy principle and required by God. Sadly, they didn't study their Bible about it either, and even if they had, would they have been able to discern the truth that God really never required polygamy? And most alarming to me is that many of these women hesitated at first, like Helen Mar Kimball did, but later agreed to become a plural wife simply because she trusted the spiritual leadership of the Mormon Church. Several of these ladies asked God for confirmation, and they received some alarmingly profound spiritual experiences confirming to them that they were to embrace plural marriage, and so they did with all their heart and soul. Of course, we know that feelings are not a barometer for truth, and spiritual experiences are not always from God. Some of these who did receive the spiritual manifestations were among those who became polygamy's most powerful advocates. Helen Mar Kimball had said that polygamy was a small price to pay for the salvation of her loved ones. I wonder if she ever found out in later years that Jesus paid the price for salvation and no one else can.
Well, as you can imagine, there's 34 women up here, but there's also 11 men. And for these men, polygamy was a great pain for them as well. Created all kinds of turmoil inside of them and problems for them. I want to introduce to you Miranda Johnson. Miranda, you step forward. And Miranda and her family in 1833 moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where she met a dynamic young Mormon convert named Orson Hyde. Dynamic young Orson Hyde, step forward there. Okay. The next year, Miranda and Orson were married, and in 1835, just a short time after their marriage, Orson was ordained an apostle of the LDS Church. And just so for your information, in the early Mormon Church, the 12 apostles were traveling missionaries, which meant that Miranda spent a great time alone in her first years of marriage. So she wasn't with Orson a lot because he was on his mission for the church. Evidently, Orson struggled with this situation as well, and in 1838 he disaffected from the LDS Church, and he wrote the infamous accusation that if Joseph Smith was not stopped, he would, quote unquote, be a second Muhammad to this generation. In 1839, however, he moved back to far west Missouri, a repentant, humbled man, and wanted to return to the church. A year later, Orson and Elder John E. Page were sent on a mission to Jerusalem. Can you imagine that? Back in the early 1800s, going on a mission to Jerusalem. In October of 1841, Orson Hyde stood on the Mount of Olives and consecrated Palestine for the gathering of Judah in the last days. And I actually visited his park that's set up there, the Hyde Park that's set up in honor of Orson Hyde traveling all the way to Jerusalem in the early 1800s. While Orson was on his mission, however, as he was returning from Jerusalem, Joseph Smith took Miranda as one of his polygamous wives. So while he was gone, without his knowledge, Joseph convinced Miranda, who was a hot, young pioneer woman, to be one of his wives. Okay? Now, we know she was hot because you're going to find out later that other men were after her, okay? So while Orson was on his mission, Joseph Smith married her. She was 26 at the time, and Joseph was 36. And we can only guess at the shock of this that this exposure to polygamy was for her, not to mention the fact that she was also entering into a polyandrous state where she already had a husband. It must have given Miranda great turmoil in her own soul. Todd Compton says that nearly everyone who has commented on their first introduction to polygamy wrote that they at first looked at it with revulsion and shock and fought the idea for a time. As Miranda was apparently in love with Orson Hyde, polyandry must have been enormously difficult for her. She and Orson had a good relationship when they were together, and so there was no reason to think that she was dissatisfied with her relationship with Orson. Although there were conflicting reports as to exactly what happens, it seems most likely that Orson did not know of the marriage, and it was reported that he was extremely upset upon coming home from his mission to learn that Miranda had married Smith in his absence. So, men, can you imagine, going on a mission, a significant mission for your church, and coming home and finding out that your young bride is now the wife of the prophet of your church? Just shocking. It would be a shocking thing. Orson, however, did not stop living with Miranda at this time. He accepted, because he accepted the prophet Joseph Smith as a religious leader, accepted the relationship and the situation, and he continued to live with her. Miranda continued to have children with Orson until 1858, so they lived together for a long time. Before his death, in 1878, Orson also married 8 additional wives and fathered 32 children. So Orson bought into the polygamy idea and became a part of that as well.
Next, I want to talk about Joseph Smith's wives number 20 and 21, the Partridge sisters. It's probably impossible to find a polygamy group anywhere that would prohibit a man from marrying sisters as plural wives. And it isn't unusual for a man to marry both a mother and a daughter. I'd like to read from Leviticus 18, just a couple of verses. It says, "Do not have sexual relations with both a woman and her daughter. It is wickedness." Verse 18, "Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living." Joseph Smith set the precedence in Mormon polygamy for violating these particular commands in Leviticus 18. He did marry mother and daughter, and he was guilty of marrying 4 sets of sisters as plural wives. The Lawrence sisters, the Huntington sisters, the Johnson sisters, and the Partridge sisters, and they're the ones I'm going to focus on now. There's 22-year-old Eliza Partridge and 19-year-old Emily. He married the younger one, Emily, first on March 4th of 1843, which was the same day that he married teenage girl, 19-year-old Flora Woodworth. Same day, 2 girls the same day, 19 years old. And 4 days later, he married Emily, Emily's older sister, Eliza, who was 22 years old. So in 4 days, Joseph Smith took 3 young brides, 2 of them 19 and 1 of them 22, and he was 37 years old at the time. The sisters had known Joseph Smith since 1831. He had baptized their father into the Mormon church, Edward. In fact, Edward became the very first Mormon bishop. In 1840, their father died. Their mother remarried a widower, and that widower just happened to be the father of the Huntington sisters, whom Joseph Smith also took as spiritual wives.